Welcome, traveler. You've returned to Snooze, scholar, where time slows, and the echoes of the past become gentle waves, lapping quietly at the shores of sleep. Tonight, we don't journey to far-off galaxies, or the depths of the ocean, or the edges of thought. No. Tonight, we ride east across windswept plains and scorching desert, to a land bathed in golden dust and bitter blood, to Jerusalem, a city ancient even in the time we speak of, a city divided, fought over, prayed to, holy to three faiths, and claimed by countless kings. But we are not here to tell the tale of empires, not tonight. This is the story of a boy who should not have ruled, who should not have fought, who should have died quietly in the shadows of power, but instead, he led armies, commanded kings, and stood against one of the greatest generals the world has ever known. This is the story of Baldwin IV, the Leper King of Jerusalem, born into privilege, cursed with disease, crowned in chaos, remembered in whispers. He lived only 23 years, but in that brief span, he held a kingdom together with nothing but sheer will, as his body fell apart around him. And tonight, we'll walk with him, not through glory, but through pain, purpose, and perseverance. We'll see how a sick boy ruled a holy city, how he defied expectations, outwitted schemers, and faced down the armies of Islam's greatest unifier, Saladin. But more than that, we'll feel the silence behind his strength, the ache in every decision, the weight of a crown pressed down on fragile shoulders. Because this isn't a bedtime story about heroes and villains. It's about what happens when fate deals you a cruel hand, and you play it anyway. So lie back now. Let the desert winds carry you. The sun is low over Jerusalem. The horses are quiet. The banners still. There is peace, just for a moment, and the king is watching from his balcony, wrapped in linen, breathing shallow but unbroken. Sleep is near, and our journey begins. Before Baldwin was ever born, before the sickness, the crown, or the sword, the land he would one day rule was already cracked and trembling. Jerusalem in the 12th century was a city on a knife's edge. To the west, the endless sea. To the east, the desert. And in between, hills of stone, olive groves, ancient roads, and the weight of too much history. This was no longer the city of prophets and parables. It had been carved into something new, something foreign. A Crusader kingdom. 90 years earlier, Christian knights from Europe, driven by a frenzy of faith, vengeance, and glory, had surged across continents in the First Crusade. They spilled blood in the name of God. They marched under red crosses, believing themselves chosen. And when they arrived in the Holy Land, they took it by fire and steel. Jerusalem fell in 1099. Its streets ran red for days. Survivors spoke of churches filled with corpses and prayers echoing above the slaughter. What was once a sacred place became a fortress, a capital city of outsiders. The kingdom of Jerusalem was born not in peace, but in violence. And yet, by Baldwin's time, it had begun to look like something permanent. A European kingdom planted in Middle Eastern soil. Castles stood on cliffs. Latin priests gave sermons. French and German nobility ruled over native peoples who spoke Arabic, Greek, Armenian, and Hebrew. But beneath the illusion of stability, the land was restless. The Crusader states were surrounded. 4 small kingdoms, Jerusalem, Antioch, Tripoli, and Edessa, scattered and fragile, like glass towers in a storm. To the north and east, new powers were rising. Muslim leaders were no longer divided. One by one, they were being drawn together by a single figure, a man of vision and discipline, Saladin. He was not yet a legend, but he was becoming one. A Kurdish general serving in Egypt, a tactician, a scholar, a man of prayer. In him, Muslims found not just a warrior, but a restorer, someone who could reclaim the Holy Land and unify the fractured Islamic world. And he was watching every crusader move, every alliance, every weakness. By the time Baldwin was born, Saladin was already rising. Egypt bowed to him. Syria would follow. The Crusaders saw it happening, but they were too divided, too proud, and too entangled in their own intrigues to stop it. Jerusalem's court was a web of ambition. Lords from Europe jostled for power. Marriages were arranged not for love, but for land. The high court argued over succession, while border towns were raided by enemy scouts. Pilgrims arrived daily, hoping to pray at sacred shrines, and often found themselves trapped in a kingdom constantly bracing for war. And in the midst of all this, the pressure, the politics, the prophecy, a boy was born. To Amalric, King of Jerusalem, and his queen, Agnes of Courtenay. He was named Baldwin. No one knew what he would become. No one could have guessed that this quiet child, pale, slim, intelligent, would become the last strong king of Jerusalem before it fell. He was born into a dying kingdom. But sometimes it is in the final flicker of a flame that the light burns brightest. The boy was born in winter, cold for the Levant, but calm, the kind of air that settles over stone like a sigh. In a castle high above the hills of Jerusalem, surrounded by palm fronds and flickering braziers, Queen Agnes of Courtenay gave birth to her second child, a son, a prince. His name was Baldwin. To the court it was a good omen, a royal heir, strong bloodline. The child's eyes were sharp even then, watching, blinking slowly under linen wraps. The midwives whispered that he would be clever. The nobles whispered that he would be king. But there was another whisper too, one unspoken, one only time would bring to life. For now, Baldwin was healthy, curious, quiet but alert. He walked the palace gardens with his tutors. He studied Latin scriptures and the old laws of the Franks. He sat in silence as visiting bishops recited long sermons, absorbing every word. To those around him, he seemed promising, a boy of gentle bearing, but with a strange stillness about him, like a lake with no wind, or a candle that never flickered. But there were signs. At first, small things. He scraped his arm one day playing with the other boys, and felt nothing. His squire told the story later, years after Baldwin was dead. How the young prince looked down at the blood on his elbow, smiled faintly, and wiped it away without flinching. It wasn't right. A few weeks later, it happened again. A bruise on his hand, deep and dark, and yet he never noticed. Then a burn from a spilled wax candle, and again, no pain. It was William of Tyre, Baldwin's tutor, a bishop and chronicler, who noticed the pattern. William was not just a scholar. He had seen illness before. He had walked through the leper colonies outside Jerusalem's gates. He knew what it meant when skin lost feeling, when wounds didn't hurt, when nerves grew silent. He said nothing at first. He watched the boy carefully, spoke to the queen in private, wrote discreet notes in his ledger, notes we still have today, yellowed with age but heavy with sorrow. Because William knew, even before any physician confirmed it. Baldwin had leprosy. In those days, it was not just a disease, it was a sentence. Leprosy meant exile. It meant your skin would change, your face would swell, your limbs would stiffen, bend, rot. It meant isolation, not just from others, but from dignity, from power, from life itself. But Baldwin was a prince, and no one knew what to do with a leper prince. There was no precedent, no path, no mercy. His condition was kept secret, hidden beneath silks and propriety. The court did what courts always do. It ignored the truth and focused on appearances. Baldwin continued his studies. He rode horses. He dined with nobles. He spoke with confidence, recited law, and attended mass. But always, behind the curtain of whispers, a pale boy with a growing shadow. The sickness moved slowly, as it often does. He still looked whole, still smiled, still laughed, still gripped his sword with youthful pride. But William of Tyre could see the change, the stiffness in the fingers, the occasional stumble, the way Baldwin's eyes sometimes glazed over when pain should have gripped him. And yet, the boy never complained. He was not ignorant. He knew what it meant. He had read the scriptures. He had seen the outcasts on the city's edge, ringing their bells to warn the clean of their presence. He knew his fate, and still, he did not flinch. That is the part history often forgets. Before Baldwin was a king, before he led armies, before he defied Saladin, before he carved out victory from dust and disease, he was a boy who accepted his death early and chose, instead, to live fully. His illness did not define his ambition. It clarified it. He didn't run from the sickness. He ruled with it. He wore it like armor. Because even at 12 years old, Baldwin understood something few ever do. You don't choose the body you live in, but you can choose what you do with the time you have. And so, in a quiet chamber, behind silk curtains and candlelight, a boy with numb hands practiced holding a sword, practiced ruling, practiced silence. The crown would come sooner than anyone expected, and death would have to wait. The crown did not wait. In the summer of 1174, Baldwin's father, King Amalric I of Jerusalem, died of dysentery alone in his tent during a campaign in the Nile Delta. The campaign was a failure. The disease spread quickly, and by the time his body was returned to Jerusalem, the kingdom had already begun to stir with unease. Amalric had ruled with strength, if not brilliance. He had expanded borders, married for power, and held the kingdom together through sheer force of will. But now, with his death, there was no strong heir, no seasoned prince, no warrior son ready to rally the court. There was only Baldwin, 13 years old, sick with a silent disease, and utterly untested. Most kingdoms would have collapsed inward. Power would have passed sideways to an uncle, a cousin, a noble with stronger limbs and a louder voice. But Jerusalem was different. It was a kingdom founded on miracles, held together by myths, and governed by ghosts. And Baldwin was something rare. The high court debated, the church hesitated, but the boy did not. He stepped forward. On the 15th of July, 1174, exactly 75 years after Jerusalem had first fallen to the Crusaders, Baldwin was crowned king. The ceremony was grand. Gold draped the church. Bells rang across the hills. The sick child stood before the altar in full regalia, hands trembling slightly beneath his gloves. To the people, he was holy, chosen, a boy touched by suffering, crowned by fate. To the nobles, he was weak, a pawn, a figure they could control. And so, the games began. The court divided quickly. Factions emerged like weeds after rain. On one side stood Raymond III of Tripoli, a cousin of the royal family, ambitious and calculating. On the other, Count Miles of Plancy, a newcomer from Europe, brash, impatient, and arrogant. Behind both of them, a web of nobles and knights, each whispering their loyalties behind linen veils. Baldwin was too young to rule outright. A regent was needed, a strong man to guide the young king, protect him, advise him. But everyone knew what that meant. To be regent was to rule, and the race was on. Miles, impatient as ever, made his move first. He forced his way into the palace, surrounded himself with guards, claimed authority without consent. He did not last long. Shortly after Amalric's funeral, Miles was found stabbed in the street, murdered by unknown hands. No trial, no suspects, just blood in the dust and silence from the palace. Most believed Raymond had arranged it. Some whispered that Baldwin himself had approved it. He never said. With Miles gone, Raymond assumed the regency. He governed with restraint, but always with eyes on the throne. And all the while, Baldwin watched. He listened. He learned. He never raised his voice, never showed panic. But within 2 years, the boy king began to move pieces of his own. He revoked certain appointments, reassigned military command, quietly undermined Raymond's authority. And when the time came, he declared himself ready to rule independently. The court hesitated. The church warned him to wait. But Baldwin didn't ask for permission. He took the throne. At 15 years old, with his hands already beginning to stiffen and his body weakening by the week, Baldwin IV began to govern Jerusalem as its full monarch. He surrounded himself not with flatterers, but with brilliant, loyal men who saw beyond his illness and recognized the steel in his mind. He kept William of Tyre close, not just as a tutor, but as a chronicler and adviser. He elevated his loyal knights and sent subtle warnings to those who doubted him. The kingdom took notice. This was not a puppet. This was a king. And yet, the pain was real. Leprosy does not wait. It creeps, it takes, it dulls the nerves and disfigures the flesh. Baldwin wore gloves almost constantly now. His face was paler, his gait stiffer, but the spark in his eyes, it remained sharp, calculating, intense. He might die young. He might never marry. But while he lived, he would rule. He understood what many did not. Jerusalem was not just a city, it was a symbol, a battlefield of faith, a torch passed from one empire to the next, and for a moment, in its long and bloody history, it was his. And he would not let it fall. Not yet. While Baldwin ruled from the stone towers of Jerusalem, another figure was rising in the east, slowly, steadily, like a tide that could not be turned. His name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. The Franks would come to fear it. In time, they would shorten it to just one word: Saladin. But before he was a conqueror, before the battles and sieges and sultanates, Saladin was just a quiet young man from Tikrit, Kurdish by blood, raised in the shadow of war, taught not just the sword, but the book. For Saladin's world was not one of brute strength, but of patience, discipline, and divine purpose. He studied the Quran. He trained under generals. He walked the corridors of power with eyes lowered, listening, learning. When others shouted, he remained silent. When others seized, he waited. But behind those quiet eyes was ambition like iron. His uncle, Shirkuh, was a general in service to the Zengid dynasty, a Muslim power rooted in Syria. Together, they rode to Egypt, answering a call to intervene in the chaos of Cairo's internal politics. What began as a diplomatic mission quickly escalated into military conquest. And when Shirkuh died suddenly, chest tight, breath gone, heart stilled, it was Saladin who inherited command. Few expected him to succeed. He was young, bookish, not feared like his uncle. But Saladin was not interested in fear. He was interested in order. He secured Egypt. He pacified rivals. He built trust with Sunni scholars, reinstated Islamic law, and slowly shifted the region's power back into Muslim hands, not through brutality, but by forging a vision that stretched far beyond borders, a vision of unity. Because Islam in the 12th century was not one empire. It was fragmented. The Abbasid Caliphate ruled in Baghdad, but held little real control. Egypt had its own leadership. Syria was divided among warlords, and Jerusalem had been lost. Saladin knew this could not stand. To him, the Holy Land was more than territory. It was sacred. It was stolen. And he believed, with quiet, absolute certainty, that it must be reclaimed. But he would not rush. He did not march on Jerusalem immediately. He bided his time. He strengthened Egypt's defenses, improved its economy, won the loyalty of soldiers, scholars, and city governors alike. And then, with careful diplomacy and just enough force, he took Damascus, then Homs, then Aleppo. City by city, region by region, Saladin forged what had seemed impossible: a united Muslim front. And all the while, the Crusaders watched. They saw the reports, they heard the names, they met Saladin's envoys and tried to guess his intentions. Some underestimated him, thought him soft, too pious, too restrained. They whispered that he preferred sermons to sieges. They were wrong. Saladin had not yet unleashed war on Jerusalem. But it was coming. He was building something massive, patient, and unstoppable, like a desert storm on the horizon, still distant, still silent, but growing darker each day. Baldwin knew this. The Leper King watched from his castle walls, reading letters, decoding messages from spies, examining maps by candlelight. He understood the threat long before many of his nobles did, because Baldwin, like Saladin, had vision. And both men knew their destinies were entangled. Their stories would not unfold quietly, side by side. They were set on a collision course, not as monsters, not as madmen, but as opposites in a holy war, two leaders bound by faith, strategy, and the burden of power. And yet, strangely, they respected each other. Saladin once sent Baldwin gifts, snow from Mount Lebanon, carried across miles to cool the king's chambers. In return, Baldwin offered peace talks even while preparing for war. Their clash was not born of hatred, but necessity. Each man saw the other not as evil, but as a rival worthy of honor. It is this strange grace that marks their conflict. Not cruelty, but clarity. Two men, both devout, both brilliant, both dying in their own way, and both willing to sacrifice everything to shape the future of the Holy Land. The winds had shifted, the desert was watching. And in the quiet before the storm, one thing was certain. Jerusalem would not stay in Christian hands forever. The only question was how long Baldwin could hold it. It began with sand. A low wind curling across the plains of Ramla, picking up dust and silence. The kind of silence that carries warning, a stillness in the birds, a weight in the air. Somewhere far off, armor creaked. Horses shifted uneasily. It was November 1177. The sun hung low in the sky, more amber than gold, more weary than warm, the kind of sun that watches but does not bless. And beneath it, two armies moved toward fate. One of them, massive, fearsome, led by the rising force of the Islamic world. Saladin had come to finish what he had begun, with over 20,000 men, cavalry, archers, veterans from Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia. He crossed into the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, believing its defenses broken, and rightly so. Baldwin was only 16. And worse, the kingdom's main forces under Count Raymond of Tripoli were far away, marching north. Saladin had moved quickly, struck boldly, and aimed straight for the crown jewel, Jerusalem itself. It should have been easy, but fate, and Baldwin, had other plans. Though sick and likely in pain that bent his bones and clouded his breath, Baldwin gathered what little he could. A skeleton army of knights, perhaps 500 strong, a few foot soldiers, peasant fighters, Templar reinforcements arriving just in time. Barely 1,000 men, against a force 20 times their size. It wasn't strategy, it wasn't strength, it was desperation. And Baldwin did not flinch. He ordered his armor strapped to his withered limbs. His fingers were barely mobile. His skin had begun to darken in places, his face pale and veiled. But his voice, soft, clear, kingly, gave the order to ride. And so they did. The boy king at the front, his banner lifted high, blue and gold against the wind. As they approached Montgisard, a rocky slope near Ramla, they saw Saladin's forces stretched out, spread thin from days of fast marching and pillaging. The Muslims had not expected resistance. They believed the kingdom broken, the enemy disorganized. But Baldwin came not to negotiate. He came to fight. And what happened next is the kind of moment that history forgets to whisper loud enough. The Crusaders charged. They charged with reckless abandon, not because they believed they could win, but because they could not afford to lose. Jerusalem was behind them, their families behind them, the church, the crown, the weight of a dying king. And Baldwin rode among them, clutching his sword with numb fingers, face veiled, body broken, heart burning. He led the charge personally, not from behind a wall, not from a throne, but from the front, in dust and danger, on horseback. Eyewitnesses would later say it was madness, but madness has power. The Muslim army, caught off guard, disoriented by terrain and arrogance, collapsed under the shock. Panic spread through Saladin's ranks. Supply lines snapped. Arrows failed to find targets. The rear guard lost contact with the front. Horses tangled, dust blinded, it became chaos. Saladin, realizing the trap, barely escaped with his life, fleeing east with only a sliver of his original force. And Baldwin? He returned victorious. At 16, sick, dying, he had defeated the most powerful man in the Islamic world. It was not just a victory. It was a miracle. Word spread quickly. Pilgrims wept in the streets. Priests declared divine favor. The people of Jerusalem, who days before had feared slaughter, now hailed their boy king as chosen by God himself. And for a brief moment, the kingdom of Jerusalem believed again. They believed they could hold the Holy Land. That faith and courage were enough. That strength came not from muscle or numbers, but from spirit. But Baldwin knew better. He knew it would not last. Montgisard was a spark, a brilliant one, yes, but it could not stop the storm that was coming. Saladin would learn. He would not make the same mistake twice, and next time there would be no surprise, no favorable terrain, no miracle. Baldwin had bought time. That was all, and he used it well. In the years that followed, he did not rest. He built fortresses, managed treaties, outmaneuvered nobles, balanced politics and faith like daggers spinning in the air. And all the while, his body decayed. But Montgisard had shown the world what he was. Not a child, not a patient, not a puppet, but a king. And history, no matter how it ends, remembers kings who ride into battle when no one expects them to. By the time Baldwin reached his early 20s, the victories had faded. The parades were long behind him. His crown still gleamed in the candlelight, but his body no longer answered to his will. Leprosy is not a sudden thief. It is slow, cruel. It takes in fragments, a finger, a step, a day of breath. Baldwin had known it was coming. He had known since boyhood that he would rot while ruling, that he would hold power with hands that trembled, that each scroll he signed, each royal decree, each act of diplomacy might be his last. But even as his bones stiffened, his vision blurred, and his voice thinned, his mind only sharpened. Where other kings grew complacent in courtly routine, Baldwin grew strategic, surgical. Every meeting, every negotiation, every alliance, measured with monk-like precision. He was no longer the boy who charged at Montgisard. He was becoming something colder, quieter, more dangerous. Jerusalem was not at peace. It never had been. But now, Baldwin was not only facing Saladin from without, he was surrounded by ambition from within. The kingdom was splintering. Powerful nobles, seeing their king falter, began positioning themselves for a world without him. The great question on every tongue: who would rule next? Baldwin had no children. His disease had guaranteed that. And so the vultures circled, whispering names, plotting matches, forging rivalries beneath the veil of courtly smiles. But Baldwin was always 3 moves ahead. He began to play a new game, one not of swords, but of bloodlines. He named his sister Sibylla's young son, Baldwin V, as his heir. A child, yes, but one untouched by illness. A vessel for continuity, a spark of legitimacy. To strengthen the boy's position, Baldwin even crowned him as co-king while still alive, a gesture almost unheard of in Crusader tradition. But this was not about tradition. It was about buying time, securing a legacy, blocking would-be usurpers. And it worked for a while, but the deeper Baldwin drifted into illness, the more aggressive his enemies became. The most dangerous among them was Guy of Lusignan, Sibylla's husband, charismatic, reckless, and in Baldwin's view, deeply unfit to rule. Guy sought glory. He preferred parades to policy. Baldwin saw in him not a king, but a catastrophe waiting to happen. And so, with limbs that barely moved and lungs that wheezed with every breath, Baldwin removed him. He formally stripped Guy of his status as heir and tried to distance Sibylla from the throne. He appointed a council, issued decrees, moved pieces as best he could. And always, he did it from bed. By now, Baldwin could no longer walk. His face was permanently veiled, his fingers wrapped in bandages. Some chroniclers say he was carried on a litter to council meetings, laid out like a corpse, but still speaking with perfect clarity. Imagine the scene. A man disfigured beyond recognition, his body broken, eyes dulled by fever, but when he spoke, the room fell silent, because his words were sharper than ever. He saw what others missed. He spoke truths no one dared say. He asked questions no one else thought to ask. Because Baldwin was no longer afraid of death. He had lived with it too long, had dined with it, ruled beside it, and in its company, he had become fearless. That fearlessness gave him power. While others played politics to win favor, Baldwin played to survive. And more than once, his foresight saved the kingdom. He maneuvered truces with Saladin when war was too risky. He strengthened border castles. He appointed Templars and Hospitallers with ruthless efficiency, rewarding loyalty, punishing betrayal. Even his enemies began to admire him. Saladin himself would later say that Baldwin was the only Frankish king he truly respected. A ruler of honor, dignity, and unmatched resolve. But the body cannot be ignored forever. By the winter of 1183, Baldwin's condition had reached its final phase. He was blind in one eye. His mouth could barely move. He suffered fevers so intense that servants placed cold stones beneath his bedding just to keep him from slipping into delirium. Still, he ruled. Still, he gave orders. Still, he tried. Because Baldwin knew the truth of power. That leadership is not about perfection, not about strength of arms or beauty of form. It is about showing up. It is about bearing the unbearable, and doing it anyway. He once told his physician that he was not afraid of dying. He was only afraid of what would happen after. He had spent his entire life holding the walls of Jerusalem in place, and now, as his strength waned, he watched the cracks reappear, the political fractures, the greed, the short-sightedness of men who had never bled for the crown. And still, he refused to let go. Because if he let go, everything would fall. By the year 1184, Jerusalem was no longer Baldwin's kingdom. Not truly. It was still his bylaw, still his in title. His name still adorned the royal seal, and prayers were still spoken for his health at every mass. But in truth, the city had begun to drift beyond his grasp. The throne room echoed a little more each day. His voice, once clear and commanding, now came only in whispers, passed from his lips to a servant's ear, then carried carefully to the council table. His hands, wrapped in linen, trembling, could no longer sign his own decrees. He was blind in both eyes now, could not walk, could not feed himself. And yet, his will was undiminished. Because Baldwin knew death was not the end. Not for him. Not for Jerusalem. The kingdom was teetering on a precipice, and its survival, or its destruction, would depend entirely on the choices he made in these final days. He had already removed Guy of Lusignan once and for all, officially, publicly. He declared the man unworthy of ruling, and he made sure that every noble, every bishop, every soldier in the city heard it. In Guy, Baldwin saw recklessness, pride, the kind of man who would charge into war simply to be remembered. Baldwin knew the cost of such vanity. He had spent his life holding back storms, and he could not stomach the thought of Jerusalem falling to arrogance after his death. But this removal sparked fury. Sibylla, Baldwin's sister, had married Guy out of love, or ambition, or both. She saw Baldwin's act as betrayal, and many in the court, tired of a king who could no longer walk, began to whisper again that the sick should not rule the healthy, that the leper should let go. But Baldwin held on. With fading fingers, he rewrote the line of succession. He crowned his nephew, Sibylla's young son, Baldwin V, as junior king, a child of only 5 years old. It was a desperate move, but a calculated one. The boy was innocent, uncontroversial, a blank slate upon which the court could project stability. To support the child, Baldwin created a regency council, noble lords, seasoned and cautious, meant to guide the kingdom without letting any single hand grasp too tightly. But everyone knew what it meant. It meant Baldwin was preparing to die. And so, the real battle began. Not with swords, but with whispers. In banquet halls and shadowed gardens, nobles began choosing sides. Some favored Sibylla, still furious over Guy's removal. Others placed their hopes in Baldwin V, trusting that a regency of cautious elders would delay chaos. And still others waited, watching, measuring, betting on when the king would finally draw his last breath. Baldwin watched it all from a darkened chamber high in the Tower of David. He did not speak often now. His breath came ragged, his chest hollowed by fever and disease. But when he did speak, his words still mattered. There's one story, maybe legend, maybe not, of Baldwin calling his council together near the end. He was carried into the room like a statue, wrapped in white, his face barely visible. The air was silent, heavy with tension. And then, with great effort, Baldwin raised a single finger, just one. And with that one gesture, he pointed, not to a map, not to a rival, but to a clause in the succession treaty that had not yet been enforced. A forgotten line. A way to delay the coronation of Guy, to give Baldwin V's regency more time. Even then, even at the edge of life, Baldwin was playing the long game, because he understood something his rivals did not. That kingdoms are not held by strength, but by patience. That thrones are not defended with armies alone, but with foresight. And that peace, however fleeting, is worth buying at any cost. But his body could not buy him more time. In the spring of 1185, Baldwin IV, King of Jerusalem, scourge of Saladin, child of prophecy and disease, faded from the world. He was only 23. There was no grand farewell, no final ride, no deathbed speech to echo through the ages. Just a slow, quiet silence that settled over the city like dust. His body was entombed in the church of the Holy Sepulchre, beneath marble and incense, as the bells rang out over the hills of Zion. But even as they rang, the court moved on, and the vultures returned. Guy of Lusignan would not stay banished. Sibylla would not stay silent. The regency would fracture. Within just 2 years, Saladin would return, this time with no surprise, no mistake, and no mercy. But that is another story. For now, let us linger in this moment. The candle has gone out. The tower is empty. The boy who became a king, the leper who outwitted lords and led armies, has finally laid down his burden. And though the kingdom will fall, his memory endures. Because in the final years of a crumbling state, when the throne was just a chair and the sword too heavy to lift, Baldwin ruled with nothing but his mind. And that was enough. The room was quiet when he died. No great horns, no banners waving in the wind, no final gasp of drama, just stillness. The kind of stillness that settles like dust in the corners of a stone chamber, where the oil lamps flicker once, then go still, where the priest whispers a final prayer, not out of ritual, but respect. Baldwin IV passed from this world in the spring of 1185. He was only 23, and yet he had already outlived what most expected of him. His birth was marked by privilege, but his body marked him for exile. He was supposed to be hidden, forgotten, buried in linen, somewhere in the shadows of power. But instead, he ruled, and in doing so, he became something more than a king. He became a contradiction, a symbol of broken strength, a leper who led armies, a child who outwitted seasoned lords, a dying man who held together a kingdom destined to fall apart. There is no word for that in the history books, but there is memory, and memory lingers. Baldwin was buried beneath stone and incense in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the most sacred site in Christendom. His tomb was simple, by royal standards, no towering statues, no golden lions, just carved marble and a name. But even now, centuries later, historians still argue over him. Was he a brilliant tactician or simply a product of luck? Was he manipulated by nobles, or did he play them all like instruments? There are no clear answers. Because Baldwin was not a tale of victory, not in the traditional sense. His kingdom would fall. His legacy would fracture. Within 4 years of his death, Saladin would sweep across the Holy Land. Jerusalem would fall. The city he had spent his short life protecting would be lost. And yet, Baldwin remains. In the shadows of old texts, in the margins of dusty scrolls, in the half-whispered stories of battlefield miracles and royal stoicism, in the way Saladin himself, Baldwin's greatest rival, spoke of him not with hate, but with admiration. Because even an enemy knows when they've witnessed something rare. And Baldwin was rare. He ruled without time, without strength, without hope. And he still won. Not the war, but the moment. That matters, because history is not only made by those who conquer, it is also shaped by those who resist. And Baldwin resisted with everything he had. With gloved hands, with veiled eyes, with a voice that never stopped commanding, even when the body beneath it could barely draw breath. He reminds us, even now, centuries later, in the quiet hours of the night, that dignity is not erased by disease, that power is not always loud, that courage can take the form of simply continuing. And tonight, as you rest your head and let sleep take you, remember this. Kings are not crowned in strength, they are revealed in struggle, and sometimes the brightest flame is the one burning in the smallest room, with no one there to see it, except history itself. Sleep now. Let the wind fade over the hills of Jerusalem. Let the candles go out, one by one. Let the banner fall gently against the stone. The Leper King is at peace, and your journey, traveler, is complete.